Hello, this is video lecture number 50. Today we are taking a look at a new topic, which is the Reconstruction of the United States. So this section is titled The Struggle for National Reconstruction. We have a few sections that we're looking at. The first is presidential approaches from Lincoln to Johnson, then Congress versus the President, then radical Reconstruction, and women's suffrage denied. So planning for Reconstruction began to take shape in December of 1863, when President Lincoln laid out his ideas in a presidential proclamation. His pronouncement opened a debate that became the central issue in American politics for more than a decade. The power struggle that followed led to a collision between the executive and legislative branches of the government. The displacement of presidential Reconstruction by congressional Reconstruction, and the first impeachment of a president of the United States. Reconstruction involved fundamental questions to begin with. Who had the primary responsibility for Reconstruction? The President or Congress? Believing that rebuilding the Union was simply a matter of suppressing rebels under presidential war powers, Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, took the early initiative, establishing provisional governments that were supposed to purge secessionists from Southern leadership. They were supposed to repudiate secession and Confederate debts, and also recognize the end of slavery. Beyond these measures, Johnson was unwilling to go. A former Southern slaveholder himself, he had no sympathy for blacks. In addition, as a Southern Democrat, he was firmly devoted to states' rights. Although Johnson was satisfied with these measures, Northerners were hearing increasingly alarming reports that white Southerners were refusing to recognize their defeat, engaging in brutal reprisals against blacks, Northern whites, and Southern Unionists, and enacting something called black codes that appeared to be backdoor attempts to restore the institution of slavery. A rising tide of Northern outrage pushed the Republican-dominated Congress toward the views of the Republicans' radical wing. In 1866, over the violent opposition of President Johnson, Congress undertook an unprecedented extension of federal power. With the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment, Congress declared for the first time that federal citizenship was not restricted by race and guaranteed all citizens equal protection of the laws, even if it required federal intervention into the affairs of a state. The outcome of the Civil War was beginning to force fundamental changes in the constitutional character of the American political system, with profound consequences for subsequent American history. So let's have a closer look then at the struggle for national Reconstruction. Our first subsection today looks at the different presidential approaches from Abraham Lincoln to Andrew Johnson. So the Constitution did not address the question of secession or any procedure for reconstructing the Union. So it did not say which branch of government was to handle the reconstruction of rebellious states and their readmission. Lincoln offered general amnesty to all but high-ranking Confederates willing to pledge loyalty to the Union. When 10% of the state's voters took this oath and abolished slavery, that state would be restored to the Union. Most Confederate states rebuffed this offer, assuring that the war would have to be fought to the bitter end. As some African Americans began to agitate for political rights, congressional Republicans proposed the Wade-Davis bill, a stricter substitute for Lincoln's 10% plan, which laid down as conditions for the restoration of the rebellious states to the Union an oath of allegiance by a majority of each state's adult white men, new state governments formed only by those who had never carried arms against the Union, and permanent disfranchisement of Confederate leaders. the Wade-Davis bill served notice that congressional Republicans were not going to turn Reconstruction policy over to the president. Now, rather than openly challenge Congress, Lincoln executed a pocket veto of the Wade-Davis bill by not signing it before Congress adjourned. Lincoln also initiated informal talks with congressional leaders aimed at finding a common ground. Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, however, held the view that Reconstruction was only the president's prerogative. Now, Andrew Johnson, a war Democrat, championed farmers and laborers. The Republicans had nominated Johnson for vice president in the 1864 election only to promote wartime political unity and also to court Southern Unionists. After Lincoln's death, Johnson offered amnesty to all Southerners except high-ranking Confederate officials and wealthy property owners who took an oath of allegiance to the Constitution. Johnson also appointed provisional governors for the Southern states and, as conditions for their restoration, required only that they revoke their ordinances of secession, repudiate their Confederate debts, and ratify the 13th Amendment. Within months, all the former Confederate states had met Johnson's requirements for rejoining the Union, and they had functioning elected governments. Now, Southerners held fast to the antebellum order, however, and enacted black codes designed to drive ex-slaves back to plantations. They had moved to restore slavery in all but the name. Southerners perceived Johnson's liberal amnesty policy as tacit approval of the black codes. So emboldened, the ex-Confederates filled Southern congressional delegations with old comrades, even including the vice president of the Confederacy itself, Alexander Stephens. So our next section is titled Congress versus the President. Republicans in both houses refused to admit the Southern delegations when Congress convened again in early December 1865, thereby blocking Johnson's Reconstruction program. In response, some black codes were replaced with non-racial ordinances whose effects were ultimately the same. And across the South, a wave of new violence erupted against the freedmen, the freed slaves. Republicans concluded that the South had embarked on a concerted effort to circumvent the 13th Amendment, and that the federal government simply had to intervene. Congress voted then to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau, gave it direct funding for the first time, and authorized its agents to investigate cases of discrimination against blacks. President Johnson was particularly angered by a congressional civil rights bill that declared formerly enslaved people to be citizens and granted them equal protection and rights of contract with full access to the courts. In early 1866, Andrew Johnson vetoed both bills, declaring that the U.S. government was for white men only. Galvanized by Johnson's attack on the Civil Rights Bill, Republicans enacted the Civil Rights Act of 1866. As an angry Congress renewed the Freedmen's Bureau over a second Johnson veto, Republican resolve was reinforced by news of more mounting violence in the South. Republicans then moved to enshrine black civil rights in the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Johnson urged states not to ratify the amendment and began to maneuver politically against the Republicans. The 14th Amendment became then a campaign issue for the Democratic Party. Johnson embarked on a disastrous railroad campaign tour and made matters worse by frequently engaging in shouting matches on this railroad tour and exchanging insults with hostile crowds. Republicans won a 3-1 majority in the 1866 congressional elections, which registered overwhelming support for securing the civil rights of ex-slaves. The Republican Party had a new sense of unity then, coalescing around the unbending program of the radical minority led by Charles Sumner in the Senate and Thaddeus Stevens of the House. Both men represented the party's abolitionist strain. For the radicals, Reconstruction was never primarily about restoring the Union, but rather remaking Southern society. All right, our next section is Radical Reconstruction. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 divided the South into 5 military districts, each under the command of a different Union general. The price for re-entering the Union was granting suffrage, or the vote, to the freedmen and disenfranchising the South's pre-war political class. Congress overrode Johnson's veto of the Reconstruction Act. After Congress adjourned, then in August of 1867, Johnson suspended Edwin M. Stanton and replaced him with General Ulysses S. Grant. He then replaced 4 of the commanding generals governing the South. When the Senate reconvened, it overruled Stanton's suspension, and Grant, by now an enemy of Johnson, resigned so that Stanton could resume office. On February 21st, 1868, Johnson dismissed Stanton. The House Republicans then introduced articles of impeachment against Johnson. A vote on impeachment, however, was 1 vote short of the required 2/3 majority needed. So Johnson wasn't kicked out of office, but he was left powerless to alter the course of Reconstruction. Grant was the Republicans' nominee for the 1868 presidential election, and he won out over the Democrats' Horatio Seymour. Republicans retained 2/3 majorities then in both houses of the Congress. The 15th Amendment forbade either the federal government or the states to deny citizens the right to vote on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, although it left room for poll taxes, property requirements, and literacy tests for voting. States still under federal control were required to ratify the amendment before being readmitted to the Union. The 15th Amendment then became part of the Constitution. Now, passage of the 15th Amendment was an astonishing feat. Lawmakers in the Western Hemisphere had left emancipated slaves in a condition of semi-citizenship with no voting rights. After the amendment was ratified, hundreds of thousands of African American men flocked to the polls across the South in an atmosphere of collective pride and celebration. Okay, so let's look at the last section. Let's look at the women. Women's suffrage denied. Women's rights advocates were outraged that the 15th Amendment did not address women's suffrage. At the 1869 annual meeting of the Equal Rights Association, Frederick Douglass, an abolitionist and women's rights advocate, pleaded with the white women to understand the importance of granting the vote for black men before white women. The convention ended in bitter debate. The majority of women's rights activists, led by Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe of the American Women's Suffrage Association, accepted the priority of black suffrage over women's suffrage. Stanton's new organization, the National Woman Suffrage Association, accepted only women, focused exclusively on women's rights, and took up the battle for a federal women's suffrage amendment. Susan B. Anthony assisted Stanton in forming this organization. In 1873, the NWSA members decided to test the limits of the new constitutional amendments. Suffragists tried to register to vote across the United States. Some were arrested because of it. In Minor versus Happersett of 1875, the Supreme Court dashed suffragist hopes for protection of women's voting rights under the 14th Amendment. The court ruled that suffrage rights were not inherent in citizenship. Women were citizens, but state legislatures could deny women the ballot if they wished. Despite these defeats, radical Reconstruction created the condition for a high-profile, nationwide movement for women's voting rights. In 1869, Wyoming granted women the right to vote. Proponents argued that voting women in Wyoming continued to carry out their responsibilities as mothers and wives while also cleaning up corruption in Wyoming politics. Okay, this does conclude today's video lecture. So at this time, please answer the review questions at the bottom of the screen and continue on with your reading and with your notes.